Hey everyone, I hope everyone has had a pretty decent Saturday. I know Door is on right now, so I don't expect a huge number of people to come to the show. But I wanted to do this video. I've been trying to do this video for the past 2 or 3 days. Wasn't feeling well the other day. I should have did it that night, but it was like 3, 4 in the morning, and it wasn't necessarily fresh, and my energies weren't all there. So I do it now. David Pakman. So every so often, members of my soapbox crew, my team, subscribers, patrons, etc., will bring something to my attention. Oftentimes they actually bring stuff to my attention. But in this case, this wasn't brought to my attention in a direct way. It was more so I've heard multiple people talking about it. Specifically the term Leninist left, which is apparently what people who are like me, that question the narrative that's being put forth in Venezuela, and had problems and qualms with Bernie Sanders' response to this in various tweets that Bernie Sanders put out. According to Pakman, Bernie Sanders was obviously right, and he was so right that this stuff kind of goes beyond questioning of what Bernie Sanders was saying in those tweets. Now, this, fair enough. Let's set that to the test. Was Bernie Sanders completely obviously right in the tweets that he put out? That's Pakman's argument here, and we're going to run with it. We're going to put it to the test. I think Pakman is massively wrong here. Not just massively wrong. The arguments that Pakman is making here is not even really an argument. Bernie Sanders said it. Bernie Sanders is a progressive member of Congress. I completely agree with everything Bernie Sanders said in all of these tweets. And it is obviously right. He goes into this thought of a few things. One, Bernie Sanders is obviously right. That's the first point. 2, the people who disagree with Bernie Sanders are hugging dictators, many of which are, hugging Maduro, hugging Chavez, hugging Fidel Castro, and all of these are bad, bad men, in which case you should be against the regime change, which he is, Gold Star, but also against these quote-unquote authoritarian dictators. And that many on the left, the quote-unquote Leninist left, are hugging dictators. I'm using the term hugging, but all intents and purposes, essentially supporting dictators. In a pursuit to push back against imperialism. I think I articulated fairly. At one point, he goes into this odd flourish about humanitarian aid, which is in the wilderness. It's almost like, somebody's out there putting in the dark on a cold day in January, while everybody else has gone home. There's no golf game. He's just in the middle of the weeds. This is not necessarily something that people are arguing about, the type of humanitarian aid. And I'll get into that tweet afterwards. But just so you know, Bernie Sanders made, I think it was 4 tweets on Venezuela. Bernie Sanders has further clarified his position on Venezuela, being pretty strong against regime change, but being somewhat wishy-washy on this issue for political reasons. He wants to politically inoculate himself from what he knows the Republican Party is going to put out as Bernie Sanders is a socialist, Venezuela is a socialist country, ergo Bernie Sanders wants to turn the United States into Venezuela. That they're going to scream that to high heaven, that is going to be their pitch. So I understand an argument, if that argument is made, which that argument is not made here, it's of saying, look, Bernie Sanders has to do what Bernie Sanders has to do for political expedience. It's gross. It's morally, problematic, but at the end of the day, if he wants to be president of the United States, he has to toe a particular line, particularly when he knows somebody is going to attack him at a various angle. Again, if your only objective is raw politics, fair enough. Meaning the humanitarian aspect of it, the fact that they're potentially starting a war by trying to peel people away from the Maduro government's armed forces, and having these 2 separate things between some random guy, Guaida, and the military. Now, these are things that could take place from the standpoint of the pressure that the United States is putting on the government, threatening, in one case, with military action while simultaneously asphyxiating it with an economic blockade, which is, by the way, an act of war. 500,000 kids died in Iraq when Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright put those sanctions through. And Donald Trump will be just as responsible for the deaths that take place in Venezuela as a result of his actions of sanctions, and the worsening of these sanctions. But let's go to Pakman, because I want this video to be relatively quick. All right, yeah, let's go to Pakman. So, let's see. This, and this. Yeah, all right. Let's hear him out.
People on the right tend to disagree with me because they want the United States to get involved in Venezuela. People on the Leninist left disagree with me because they sometimes idolize Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. So that's me, just to kind of set this up. In comes Bernie Sanders, and he tells us his view, and it's effectively identical to my view, and he's getting crushed for it. I mean, just absolutely obliterated by elements of the left on Twitter and on the internet. So let's first start with Bernie's tweets on January 24th about this issue. Bernie Sanders, the most progressive member of the U.S. Senate, said about the situation in Venezuela, quote, "The Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society. True. Violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly. That's correct. And was reelected last year in an election many observers said was fraudulent. That's absolutely accurate. The economy is a disaster. That's correct. And millions are migrating. Absolutely correct. Estimated 10% of the Venezuelan population has left the country." Bernie goes on. "The United States should support the rule of law, fair elections, and self-determination for the Venezuelan people. That does not mean American involvement. We must condemn the use of violence against unarmed protesters. That's absolutely correct. And the suppression of dissent." And then Bernie goes on to finish by saying, "But, and this is important, we must learn the lessons of the past and not be in the business of regime change or supporting coups as we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic. The United States has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down that road again."
Pakman agrees with everything that's said in these tweets. If Bernie Sanders would have left it as the last tweet, this one. "But we must learn the lessons of past and not be in the business of regime change or supporting coups, as in we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil, Dominican Republic. The U.S. has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down that road again." Yes, all of that is flat fact true. If Bernie Sanders would have left it with that, no issue. Zero issue. Everybody goes home and walks away. Everybody from the standpoint of the left feels good about what was said. But that's not what took place. Bernie Sanders is doing this wishy-washy dance, again, for political reasons, but he's doing somewhat of a wishy-washy dance. You can imagine that people who look at this and understand what this is, a cynical ploy in order to take the resources of another country, of Venezuela, essentially preying on the country to create enough economic asphyxiation to cause public destabilization of the society itself. When you have a patsy, Guaida, some random guy, declaring himself president or interim president of Venezuela, interacting with the United States as being their guy on the ground. That's what's taking place. People know that. People who are looking at this story know that. If this was the last tweet, no issue. If this was the first tweet, no issue. But Sanders didn't start there. Sanders started with this tweet. "The Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was reelected last year in an election that many observers say was fraudulent. The economy is a disaster. Millions are migrating." That's regime change rhetoric. That is literally what that is. That is the basic argument that people make when they start on this path of whether or not we should topple the elected government of a particular country in order to get our hands on their resources. They start with language exactly like this. The fact of the matter is, this is not necessarily all flat fact true. The Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society. I wonder what a Pakman government will look like if it was under threat from a superpower to the north and countries that were around that were essentially allied with that superpower threatening military action, if not of itself, of one of its proxies. Not to mention a coup attempt going back in the thousands, in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. So let's be very clear what we're talking about. This is a country that's under attack. It's under attack. It's under a blockade. But fair enough. There's some wiggle room here. I can understand the argument, and even with the standpoint of the Maduro government is waging a violent crackdown, that doesn't really take the full context into picture with the opposition setting stuff on fire, killing people. I mean, come on, be fair. Violated the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly. Even that is conjecture to some degree. Like, the UN investigator in human rights, Alfred D. Zayas, makes a different argument, making the point that this is within the realm of the Constitution of Venezuela. You may not like it, but it is within the power of Maduro to do. You understand what I mean? There's more context to that. My point, but I don't want to get hung up on this first part, but my point is this. Even that is not necessarily flat fact true in the way that's being made. There's more context, there's more gray in that particular statement, even though taking this particular language puts us as if Maduro is a horrible, horrible guy. But we shouldn't overthrow him, which cedes the initial ground to the people who want to overthrow those governments. And for a second point, Maduro was elected. Chavez was elected. Whether Pakman likes Maduro or not is somewhat secondary to the point. The people of Venezuela made a choice on who they wanted, and they elected him. When Chavez was deposed, meaning when a coup attempt was formed for Chavez, trying to get Chavez out that office, do you know people came out in the streets in order to get Chavez back? Whatever Pakman thinks of Chavez is irrelevant to that process if the people were willing to choose Chavez and choose Maduro. It is up for the people of Venezuela to determine the direction for the people of Venezuela, right? Sanders? I mean, that is Sanders' perspective, right? The economy is a disaster, true. Millions are migrating, true. But why is the economy a disaster? I mean, yeah, there's an aspect of this that's the fault of Maduro himself, but there's also an aspect where you have a superpower putting his knee on your throat in this rank opportunism. I mean, come on. That's not flat fact true. More troubling is the second part, meaning the second tweet that Bernie Sanders did on this issue. And let me get to this. And the wild part about this one is not only does Pakman completely miss the problem with this tweet, he goes on saying he agrees with everything in this tweet. When the problem with this tweet that he didn't even enunciate in this particular video, he could have looked at what Ben Nord was saying at the bottom and asked the question, why is the Red Cross not working with the United States on this issue? Why? Here we are. Let's take a look. All right, let's start here.
One that Bernie tweeted over this past weekend, where he added to his commentary on Venezuela, saying, the people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. That's correct. Nicolas Maduro denies it, but they are. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters.
Now, Pakman full-throatedly agrees with this. I'm putting the video at the bottom. You can see it for yourself. I don't want to mischaracterize him. Full-throatedly agrees with this. This tweet is repugnant. This tweet is utterly repugnant. The people of Venezuela are enduring a severe humanitarian crisis. First, Yemen is a humanitarian crisis. You know, let's get our words straight. Let's have words have meaning. Syria, humanitarian crisis. Libya is a humanitarian crisis. Does Venezuela in any way match those countries? The answer to that question, of course, is no. Are they enduring economic stress? Yes. Are there people who are at the bottom end of the economic scale may not be getting their needs met? That answer may also be yes. But is this a humanitarian crisis? Come on. Unless words no longer have meaning, humanitarian crisis doesn't necessarily apply here. The United States is trying to make it a humanitarian crisis. Also, just so we're very clear here, how cynical of it is the United States to instigate a crisis? Meaning, the sanctions are not making things better, the sanctions are making things worse. You're instigating or attempting to create a humanitarian crisis. There's some cases where dialysis supplies aren't being or were denied because, again, sanctions. There were other cases where insulin or medicines, again, because of sanctions, those sanctions were put on by the United States in order to prey on the resources of Venezuela. Pakman understands this, he even agrees to this, but misses the point that the United States is creating a humanitarian crisis and then turning around saying, we're going to give you humanitarian aid. Does he honestly believe that Donald Trump Abrams, John Bolton, two of which are war criminals. Donald Trump is working on his way to being a war criminal. And one of which that has had a history of putting guns or weapons or weapons in humanitarian aid prior, meaning having humanitarian aid be a proxy or a Trojan horse for military assistance to opposition figures. There's a reason. I guess my point is this. None of those three, the war criminals included, have the best interests of Venezuela at heart. Why would Pakman believe that the humanitarian assistance that these guys are giving to them are for the best interests of Venezuela? Why? In fact, not just that. Don't take my word for it. Look at the tweet below. He could have just looked down. The United Nations and the Red Cross both oppose Trump's administration's fake humanitarian stunt in Venezuela. It's a Trojan horse to push right-wing regime changes. It has nothing to do with helping people. Why is a self-declared socialist falling for this? Don't take his word for it. Red Cross and UN slams politicized U.S. aid humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. You're creating a humanitarian crisis, as you call it. Then you're turning around saying, we're going to give you some aid. How about this? How about just stop the sanctions? How about that? Keep your aid, and how about stop the sanctions? That makes all the sense in the world if you care so much, but they don't care so much. This again goes to this idea of trying to institute regime change. This is done by a cynical ban in the United States to get their hands on the resources, and is worsened by a cynical politician in the name of Bernie Sanders, who's inoculating himself with attacks from Venezuela, using the misery of the people of Venezuela itself to do so. Just saying. If you're asking me why people have issues with this tweet, that's why people have issues with this tweet. It's cynical. It's grossly cynical and somewhat of a slap in the face. So I don't quite understand why. I don't understand why Pakman doesn't understand that. If Pakman is indeed against regime change, and the people who are involved in this process is trying to institute a regime change, why on earth is Pakman okay with these people instituting things that would institute regime change? Why is he so okay with this idea of humanitarian aid? And hey, by the way, they did accept humanitarian aid. Just to make that point. They just didn't accept it from countries that were trying to overthrow the country. Yeah, they accepted it from Russia. No, they wouldn't accept it from the United States, because the United States is the country that's instigating this quote-unquote crisis and is working with other countries to make this crisis worse. I mean, for fuck's sake, they're calling some random guy on the street the interim president of the United States, breaking all notion of international norms in order to do this. And it's made even worse because it's not even something that's hidden. It's just open and available for anybody looking at what they're doing to see what's taking place. It's not like in the 60s and the 50s where these guys with the CIA would do something and people would be like, oh God, the government just kind of fell. Well, the CIA was working in the shadows. They're not working in the shadows on this. This is open and overt. And by the way, I don't think I've said much about Maduro at all in this entire thing, because it has nothing to do with Maduro. It has nothing to do with Chavez. It has nothing to do with anybody. In this case, it has everything to do with what is the interest of the United States government in working with the other governments for Venezuela. And is that interest in the best interest of Venezuela? The answer is no. Why do you believe that the aid that was going to Venezuela by the United States was also going to be in the best interest of Venezuela? I don't understand why you're so gullible on this. And again, even made worse still, that Pakman's supreme intelligence didn't even see the bottom thing below Sanders' tweet and didn't ask the secondary question of why is the Red Cross and the United Nations organizations that deal with humanitarian issues not working with the United States. And they're not working with the United States because they understood it was a stunt. They absolutely understood it. Regime change is not just about the sanctions and everything else. False flags are also part of this stuff. Politicized stunts. Media, in many cases, become a certain degree of warfare in regards to what you can shape, the narrative that you shape. But if the only media that you're looking at is mainstream media, they're going to shape a particular narrative that has a bipartisan consensus on issues of regime change. They've always had it. They continue to have it. So, mainstream media in the United States is not unbiased. Just saying. And just the last point, the humanitarian thing. He goes into the weeds with this. And he starts having this flourish about the type of humanitarian aid that's, It's not the issue.
Progressives shouldn't do apologetics for authoritarian regimes.
Nobody
There
is.
are some Leninist left actions can be held simultaneously in perversion of aid that is being sent to Venezuela.
Here we go. So, it's progressives shouldn't back up dictators, the Leninist left, all this good stuff. Yes. Again, has nothing to do with Maduro at all. Has everything to do with what are we doing? Us. In this particular country, in the countries that have been organized around for this particular endeavor. What are we doing? And are we doing anything that's making this issue materially worse? And if so, then that should be the topic. That should be the topic. Stopping what we're doing to make it worse. Adding Maduro into this is somewhat of a red herring. Let's take a look at this. Let's see if this is...
With the type of aid that is being sent to Venezuela. You believe that instead of sending food, we're better off, or they will be better off, if we send the equipment and source materials for making their own food. I'm right there with you, right? We've been talking for years about how a lot of the types of aid that is sent around the world, humanitarian aid.
In the weeds. Hey, it's blue outside today. It's really a nice day. How are you doing? The moon is made of Swiss cheese. What? Are you okay? The moon is made of Swiss cheese, goddammit, and I mean it, and I'm aggressively pushing for it. It's like it has nothing to do with anything that I've just mentioned. And I strongly suspect that the issue that people were having with Bernie Sanders' tweets wasn't the type of humanitarian aid. It was the humanitarian aid in and of itself coming from a country that's cynically trying to take its resources. Just saying. I'm going to end this here. I think I made the points that I wanted to make. I want to put... Abby Martin has a great video with the UN Human Rights Rapport on this particular issue. And beyond that, Abby Martin, if you don't like Abby Martin, Ben Norden, Max Blumenthal, it adds more gray into the narrative that's being spun around the Venezuela thing. And I got to be honest, not accepting the first premise of this gets you further and bang for your buck, as opposed to accepting the narrative that's being made for regime change and then simultaneously saying, well, we shouldn't do it. I guarantee you, many people don't understand not doing it the moment that you make the first argument saying, Maduro's a horrible, disgusting guy. He doesn't wash his hands when he goes to the bathroom, and he, feeds his nieces tacos or something. I don't know. I'm just making the point that seeding the first point, if there's gray area in the first point, gets you more bang for your buck than immediately agreeing with people who are pushing a regime change narrative, but then saying, but we should show restraint. All right. I'm going to end this. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Pakman would fit right in at TYT. I thought he was, to some degree, part of TYT. No one said anything about Venezuela's sanctions when Obama put them on. Typical fake progressive. The difference here is he is absolutely actually trying to push regime change. Donald Trump has ratcheted up the sanctions that much worse. So either you are a Trump apologist, which it seems like you are, or your perspective of reality is a little bit off. Love Abby Martin too. Just lift the sanctions. That's kind of my point, Trudy. That's my point. Like, if the argument is made that we're going to send humanitarian aid, you know how you can send humanitarian aid? Lifting the sanctions. So I'll leave it here. Those sanctions have been ratcheted up, and with the specific aim of creating chaos in the country itself. That's the first point. But the chaos in the country is used in order to put pressure on the population itself to pull down the polling numbers of the ruling government. Meaning, if you're not able to get access to the things that you need, the people may blame the government itself for being in that position, which lowers those poll numbers. It makes a much better chaos that allow notions of regime change, because at that point you can have the media get involved in the process. Also, this idea of the opposition itself. The opposition is being tuned to millions. And it's like this notion that these guys get out there cause chaos and havoc within the society itself. Then Maduro does something, and automatically the United States says, oh my God, I can't believe they're killing protesters or they're attacking protesters. This is far grayer than what the mainstream media is trying to push it. And the fact of the matter is, leaving out this element of regime change in the U.S. history that mainstream media typically does. They have a specific narrative that they go with, and there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington for it. So, and to that matter, to show the level of bipartisan consensus, Bernie Sanders even feel he needs to be wishy-washy. But like I said, this is more for political expedience. Sanders, if Pakman made the argument, if he just made the basic argument, Bernie Sanders needs to toe a particular line, because if Bernie Sanders doesn't toe a particular line, he will be attacked relentlessly on the issue of Venezuela. Meaning, if he comes out and says he doesn't want to do regime change, they're going to attack him on Venezuela, saying he's an apologist to Maduro. And so what do? You're more hawkish on the thing that you're trying to defend. So if anybody tries to assail you on that particular position, you say, look at my works, look at me. I'm giving you the regime change argument. I just don't think we should go that far. And in other cases, I'm trying to get into humanitarian aid, even though I know that it's a Trojan horse ploy. It's I get what Pakman is saying to some degree, and saying, kudos to Sanders for bringing this up. But many of the people who are criticizing this aren't politicians. Their goal in this is not to be politicians. Their goal is somewhat of a moral argument of what's right. That's the problem with this. Bernie Sanders is a politician. So it's like, yeah, I don't particularly like it, even though I understand it. And yeah, people are going to have issues with it because of it. So, meditating Jesus, working people the world over have the same plan, have the same goal. 90% of the world's citizens are in agreement. Now, let's start a government based on that. Oh man, I love that notion. I love that notion. I love that notion. Yeah, I love that notion. All right, I'm going to end this. I may have additional shows tonight. My wife is still not feeling well. She may have an ulcer. So Miss Thomas may or may not be here tomorrow. And I was hoping that she would do a show with me today, but I'm not sure if that's going to take place. But we'll see. You may see me later tonight if I'm up and kicking. And I'll see you guys then. Thanks all. Worst come to worst, I'll see you guys tomorrow at 1 p.m. for the Patron Appreciation episode. But hopefully, maybe, I'll see you guys later tonight. Thanks all.